The question is, what is a contingency when you're refurbishing property and why it's so critical for your project? Let's have a look. When you're trying to refurbish a property, the more complex your project, the more important a contingency is going to be. And therefore, the more important that you know how to use it, how to set it, and to understand some pro tips that you can use to improve every time. Now, a contingency is basically extra money that you put aside for your project. Basically, you've gone through different stages of your project. The first one was to buy the property. Then what you've done, hopefully, is to spend enough time in planning what you're going to do with that property. And the more complex, again, the more important that planning type. So this would normally mean that you could go, not everybody does it, but you could go with an architect or somebody who can do proper drawings of your property. And then once those are done, you can start playing in terms of what layout you want to achieve to optimize along with the strategy that you want to use. And that's where planning in terms of knowing what you're going to do and the planning side of regulations comes in together because they both go together. What you're going to do on physical needs to bear in mind the restrictions of the local regulations. And that's where planning really, really helps. The more time you put into planning, the better for your project, the easier it's going to be working through those plans. But I know many people that want to save 1,000 in drawings or even more, depending on who you're using and where in the country that project is. They will try to save that money so they can go fast into refurbishment. But in my opinion, if you don't plan this ahead, then you won't have the most important, the most critical communication tool that you will ever have during these refurbishment projects for you and your team. And when things go wrong is here where these tools help. Let's say you want certain layout and you give the drawings to the builder. And the builder makes a mistake and he creates a different layout or a smaller layout. The problem is that that layout is critical for you to meet regulations. You can have this conversation. Look, I gave you the drawings. This is exactly what I wanted you to do. Now, this is your fault. Please repair it from your own pocket. And that conversation is not abnormal. If you are using especially new contractors, which you may have not tested before, and that happens. This contingency is so critical because many things, as I will show you in a second, can happen during a refurbishment. Believe me, I tell you this from experience. Every single refurbishment brings something different to the table. There are common themes there, which I will show you in a second, but there is always different and there is always something that you find underneath the plaster, if I can put it that way. Now, this contingency is never a science. It's just a way to create a buffer for your project, and over time you can get more and more accurate with it. But it's never a science. There is something else that comes up, and then you will have to deal with. The reason this safety net, this budget is so critical is because the worst possible thing that can happen to you during a refurbishment process is that you run out of money. Imagine you are 90% there in your project and then something comes out and you have no more money and you cannot find any more money. Then you will struggle to finish your project. You'll struggle to pay the loan on which you might be financing that project. And if that stops there, the workers will leave, the banks and the lenders will come for their payment. If you don't give it to them, you will have to give them your property and everything you put into it. So that's the worst mistake that can happen to you in a property refurbishment. So that's basically the reason why you need to have a contingency. That's financial security for your project. You need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That's what I mean in these kinds of contingency. if you don't have money, you're going to stress during this project, and the contingency, hopefully you don't use it, but it's always going to be there for you to say, okay, if you have any problems, here we are. We are well prepared for this, and we can handle small deviations or medium size deviations that could be threatening this project as such. So that's a financial safety net for your project you need to think about. Now, how you go about calculating the right amount of contingency for your process? Let's have a look. It really depends on the complexity of your project again. So if you're talking about a buy-to-let, as we have here, a buy-to-let normally in the UK, for the ones who know and who've done this before, you know that to get a buy-to-let finance, the property must be ready to move in. It might have some very slight cosmetic issues, but the property must not have any major defects. If the bank sees any of those effects there, they will ask you to pay extra money before you even buy the property, which doesn't kind of make sense. Now, because of that condition, because of that situation with a buy-to-let, you normally set 2 to 5% contingency. And the reason you set that sort of contingency is because when you go and inspect a property, you normally cannot do an 100% inspection, and you might find things like the boiler needs servicing. In the worst case, the boiler might need replacement. When the valuator for a bank goes to a property, they see the property physically, but they don't test the boiler. They don't test the gas. They don't do all of that. They will ask for gas safe certificates to lend you the money and electrical condition report. That's to the seller at that point. But they won't test the boiler, and it might be that that boiler needs replacement. We'll be talking about for a buy-to-let, a 3-bedroom house buy-to-let, we might be talking about £3,000 that you might have to put in there. So that's why you would have to put 2% to 5% contingency in this process. Now, if we move to something heavier, something more difficult, like a conversion from a residential house to a HMO, now we are talking about more complexity. And these pictures that you see here, actually, they are pictures of real property we are converting at the moment, where we found, once we started removing some of the items around, we started finding leaks, we started finding a damp, which had to be now fixed. And as I said, when we went to see this property, yes, you see the damp, but you don't see where it's coming from. And you cannot go and open walls before you buy the property, because nobody's going to allow you to do that. And you can only guess what it could be. In this case, for this property as such, as I said, we had a leak from the chimney. We have the gutters leaking and even a plant out there. And we have this damp, which we didn't know it was coming from. We thought it was coming from here as well. But also we had one at ground level, which was coming from the outside. Basically, the ground was over the damp-proof course, and that was passing moisture into the bricks. And bricks are sponges, again, and they will take water by osmosis and then transfer it to the inside of the house. That's what was happening. But apart from that, and I'll show you in a second, there were more things that we determined when we had to go into the property and start refurbishing. Now, for that sort of heavy refurbishment, about 15, 20%, and 10% is a little bit optimistic, but it moves from that range. Again, as I said, it's not a science. This is not a science. This is more to do with what you're doing, the type of project that you're setting up, the location that you are working at, because it influences material costs, labor costs, etc. And therefore, you need to have that value there. So the way this works is you do the plannings, the drawings, and then plan everything that you need to do. You can do normal drawings for layout. You can do electrical drawings. You can do hydraulic drawings as well. And in that way, you'll have a very clear picture as to what the total price is going to be. On top of that, you need to include into that planning what the regulation is telling you that you need to do. So you make sure that you're working towards a certification of the building or the property, a licensing, it would be a better word than certification, a licensing for that property. So you need to be thinking about that from the very beginning. Now, if you were working into other type of buildings like listed and heritage buildings, I don't go anywhere near this, you will be talking about 20 to 30% contingency. The reason for this is that listed buildings, the process is a lot more difficult because to do any external or internal changes to the property, you need to have permits, you need to have somebody checking, it needs to be of specific material, sometimes the same material that the property is built with, and then you need to go and find that material, same color of bricks, etc. So it's more difficult, it's more detailed, and therefore the contingency, not only in financial contingency, but also the time contingency that you need to put in place to finish that project is larger than other projects. Therefore, that's what you need to understand. The more difficult the project is, the more moving parts it's got, the higher the likelihood is that something can go wrong. And therefore, the contingency is there for you to understand that even though you've done your plan correctly, that you've done your budget to the best of your abilities, then still something can go wrong. Something will go wrong. You'll find something under the plaster, and then you need to fix it because otherwise it will destroy whatever you do. For example, if we were to ignore this leak here, and we just paint it over it, then what's going to happen is going to destroy whatever we put in here, and it's going to be a nightmare because here, for example, we are doing a bathroom, and therefore everything is going to be covered. We don't fix this now, it's going to be a nightmare. That's why you need to be able to do that and then go to the next stage once you fix that. Now, the factors that influence the contingency on your project, there are multiple factors, but there are some special ones. The older the property, the more contingency you're going to have to put or at least plan for, because the older the property, depending on the owners, but it's almost the case every time, the more water damage is had, roofs degrade, walls degrades, water goes into the property, wood gets rotten, etc., etc. And therefore, the older the property, the more important the contingency is. For modern properties, you normally actually have a 5-year guarantee if it's a new property, and still you can find defects. It's not that you buy a new property, you won't find defects. You will, and hopefully not critical, but that doesn't mean you're getting 100% efficient working house. But in an old property, you can find things like wet rot, dry rot, lead piping, outdated wiring, meaning you need to do a full rewiring of that. That you should be able to know when you see the electric fuse, and depending on what you want to do with the property. For this property, for example, that I showed you just before here, we are changing this property from 4-bedroom to 5-bedroom, 5 bathrooms. Therefore, the electrical demand for the house is going to increase. Therefore, we need to do a full rewiring of the property. That's something that's going to happen. But then that factor wouldn't be a contingency. That would be part of the planning because it's big enough for you to see it before you even start and for the plans that you need to do. If the full rewiring is part of the contingency, then you need to have a look at your team because they're probably not doing things correctly. And as I said, the other factor is complexity. If it's cosmetic, then it's not that expensive like a buy to let. If you're changing the layout, if you need to fix the foundations, if you need to change load bearing walls, all of that is going to mean that the likelihood of finding surprises during that project is going to be higher. Therefore, you need to plan for your contingency. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, let's have a look at two case studies. One is this property which we just bought for a client in 13 Bardside Road, L7 Liverpool. This is the property as it was bought. It's a 2-bed property. It was bought with £40,000. The purchase price was 112,000. The contingency we set for this property was 5%. And so far, we are now, at the time of recording this video, we are furnishing the property. The tenants are ready to move. And so far, we haven't found any defects that need any refurbishment or any usage of the contingency. Now, a pro tip for you is that you won't know until the tenants move in and they are in the property for about a month that you'll understand if the contingency is being saved or not in this case, for example. Because when they move in and start testing everything, that's when you see that some of the details maybe were not captured. But normally, those are small things like door locks. Maybe the radiators are not heating enough. Maybe they need a bleeding. Maybe the water in the bathroom is not hot enough. Then something to do with the valves. Whatever it is, the more you test the property before you give it to the tenant, the more you're going to decrease this. But you always will have something that is to test. So this case study, as I said, it's £40,000 money for the investor and then no contingency so far, but probably something is going to be used. Now, for this property, we spent about £4,000 for the furnishing, but again, that's not contingency. This is part of the plan at the beginning with the property. But so far, so good. Hopefully, these £1,000 that we planned can go back into the profit margin and no other money has to be spent. That would be good. Now, the next case study that we're working on is this one, which is a home HMO renovation in Liverpool. And this is a full conversion from 4-bed to 5-bed and 5-bath HMO. The budget for this HMO is 90,000 to do the full refurbishment, completely from changing the layout of the property and doing everything that we need to do. But the contingency for this project was set to 12%. Now, when we started working on the project, you have already seen some of the pictures that I showed you before. We have the following issues. For example, the first one, we had a builder who's been working with us very well at small projects. And then we decided to tell him whether he was prepared to work on this project because it's much larger and it requires a lot more resources, a lot more knowledge. He said, yes, I have a team, we can do it. And then we started the project. We gave him about £2,800 to start with. But 2-3 weeks within the project, we realized he had not the skills to work at this level. He was going to work with a team he was just setting up. And it seems that team didn't work out for him, so he couldn't deliver. Now, this person had been working with us in small projects, small DIY projects, and doing stud walls, doing repairs, painting, and he was doing things correctly, well. But when we put him into a much larger project, he couldn't deliver. And therefore, what's happened, he's spent £1,400 of that money, and then we are chasing the other £1,400 for him to pay. He's agreed to pay. Hopefully he does. But then this is a situation. The problem is once we went to find other builders to do what he was quoted for, the quotes came almost double as much for that project. And that's something that is not uncommon. Finding good builders is one of the most difficult things to do in the UK. Finding builders which are skilled and builders that they are conscious enough to say, yes, I can do this or I cannot do that. And builders, especially, that if something goes wrong, they take responsibility for the situation. And we've had lots of problems with builders. We've had really, really good builders, the ones that we continue to use, but we've had cases with really bad builders, which I don't know what their thinking is, but real business comes from repeat business. If somebody is just trying to screw investors in one project and they need to find another new investor, that's not sustainable way of doing businesses. And we've found those kind of builders. And that's why you need to be careful. You need to build relationships with those good builders you find, those who work with quality, are conscientious, they are fast, and they understand that each property is a business. Each property needs to perform. The project needs to be finished as soon as possible. Is the efforts and the life savings that the investor has had. And most of the properties that are bought and refurbished in the UK, they don't really come from super wealthy individuals. They come from people who have worked really hard to save money and to put their money for their future into a project which is complex and difficult to achieve. That's, I think, hopefully that's a message for people to understand. Now, more additional expenditure that we had so far in the project is that we had to put a steel beam to remove one of the walls in the kitchen. There was a change in the design, and that means that now we had to remove a wall, and that costed £3,600 because there was a steel beam and everything else that entails to put that in there and to make sure it works. That alone is £3,500. Now, the next one we found is that we had to do an asbestos report. We were told there was not asbestos in the property. Then one of the electricians, they were drilling through a ceiling. They thought, this is asbestos, we need to stop. We stopped the whole process, the whole refurbishment for a week, did a full test for asbestos for £100. Nothing was found. We managed to start again. But these kind of things is just a sample of what can happen. Another one that we had is the relocation of our electricity meter, which we didn't plan for. We were hoping we would keep it where it was, but then for management facilities, for management efficiency, we actually had to move it to one of the halls, and therefore, there you go. It's £700 more that were not in the budget. And this was about 6,000 more than we had in the contingency. Now, this project is still going, and we still have a little bit of the budget. We have about 50% of the contingency still there, hoping we don't find anything else. But this, I'll tell you this just because it's a good example of what happens in every single refurbishment, in every single property that you buy. When you go and visit a property to buy it or to evaluate it, if you want to buy it, you only really have 30 minutes, and then you go around, take videos, do everything that you need to do, and then you could put an offer. Now, if you can, and if you're doing something for a buy-to-let, it doesn't normally happen when you're going to do a refurbishment this large. If you're going to do a buy-to-let, you could pay for additional inspection, actually 3 levels of it. The third one is the more comprehensive. It's about £800, and they will check and they will actually look into the structure of the building. They will be very comprehensive. If you want to do that for buy-to-lets, by all means, and you get the results, and then you can renegotiate the price. For these projects like the one I'm showing you here, normally these projects, you're going to get in, you'll have to evaluate the biggest issues that you'll have to fix during the process, and then go ahead, put that in the budget. Because this, for example, this property, there was a lot of competition to get it, and we were going to do a full refurbishment anyways. As long as for example, the costs are not prohibitive, like you need to replace the full roof. And when you put that into your financial model, it would make your return on investment something that is not within your standards, then don't go ahead. But it's an art in terms of looking at a property, understanding what needs to be done, and knowing within your financial model whether that property is worth it. If this property, for example, had subsidence, then you would have to add between £5,000, £10,000 more to fix that subsidence, and understand that probably is going to give you some trouble with insurance. But again, is knowing case by case as to what's going to happen. Now, 3 tips to manage that contingency effectively. So one is to put that money in a different pot than you have your refurbishment money. So at least you have visibility of it. The second one is that when you have these issues, like for example, the relocation of the electricity meter I just talked about, look at the problem from different angles and understand if you have at least 2 possible solutions, the costs, what you want to go ahead with. Because it might be that a cheaper solution is still going to be okay for this project. And that's something that can apply for anything. Normally, when somebody gives you a quote, they might give you the quote to give you the best solution, but that best solution might be too expensive for your project. Therefore, you need to think from different angles. And this happens at very other points in property. Now, when you think about these different angles, you shouldn't be compromising health and safety. You shouldn't be compromising the quality required to complete that project. Because if, for example, you put really, really cheap accessories or really cheap materials within your property just to go and get it rented, you might have to pay for that later on when tenants start using it. Now, the third tip here is to learn and review from the lessons from past projects. Once you start doing this again and again and again, for each project, try to spend some time thinking, okay, what went wrong here? What was the cost and how we can avoid it next time? You include that in your planning in the next project. And hopefully with that information, you can make your budget more accurate. Still will have a contingency, but with that information, you'll have more experience to get those budgets right and to suffer less during the next project, for example. That's super important right there. Now, when you're starting to build a property or you're starting a refurbishment project, what normally happens is that most of the contingency will be spent around here, because this is where you start doing the strip out, restore the before you do the first fix, which is the strip out is the stage where you actually can remove kitchens, bathrooms, carpets, painting. All of that comes out. You might even take the property to bare brick, and that's when you find cracks, when you find holes in the property, when you realize where the moisture is coming from, when you maybe lift the floorboards and you understand that something down there that is not as good. But that contingency is mostly spent in these two stages. So the strip out, which is the first stage of the property, then the first fix. And then from then on, you'll have some additional contingencies, probably because of material increase and some labor changes maybe. But if you don't know what first fix and second fix is, just look at this picture. This first fix is when you have the property all stripped out and then you start putting wiring, piping, studs, all of that goes ceiling, plaster. And then second fix is when you start putting the nice things, the beautiful things like the frames, the sockets, install kitchens and all that, which actually really makes the property look beautiful. But really what's doing the hard work in a property is hidden and is done during the first fix of the process. So that's for you, hopefully, to take that into account. Now, important mistakes to avoid. The first one is that the contingency is to spend for non-planned work, is not for upgrades. When first-time investors are doing a property, they make a mistake, which is potentially to fall in love with the project and somehow thinking they're going to live there. But that house, as I say to my investors, the last time you're going to see that property as beautiful as they see it is when they finish it, they get the keys, and then once they rent it, the property is not going to look as beautiful. So don't worry, design the property to achieve as much income as possible, but don't fall in love with the interior decoration, and it's not a mansion, so you can extract as much as possible from it, but keeping your costs down. So contingency is for repairs, unplanned repairs, but not upgrades. So that's very important. The other one is thinking that you won't have issues in a property, in a refurbishment, thinking that everything is going to be fine. And that optimism is almost never the case. There is something always in this project. Something happens, something needs to be repaired, because normally when these properties are sold, property is people who've been living there for years and they don't really pay attention to the maintenance of the properties. Some people do, but most of the people, they don't do that. And therefore you as an investor need to come in to repair those. Also, if your project is taking 6 months, a year, you'll find that your prices, especially material prices at the beginning of the project, are lower than at the end because of inflation. And that's something that might affect the cost. Hopefully that cost is borne by the contractors, but it's also that can affect you if you need to do an unplanned repair because you need to buy additional materials. Something to think about, these common mistakes. Now, as I said at the beginning, in terms of a contingency, is the case of you need to plan for the worst and hope for the best. You need to manage that contingency properly. You need to understand through different projects what you did right, what you did wrong, or what went wrong. Try to avoid it. Spend as much time as possible in planning. Look at what you need to do. What's the end goal? What the regulations are requiring? What the house is telling you? And working with a good team, experienced team, which know and understand that each project is sacred for each investor. No property investor has an infinite surplus of cash. Then by your team knowing that, they'll understand and make an effort to make each project a success and to make that project work for the investor who's risking lots of money, a lifetime savings sometimes, to get it to work. And it's as stressful as it is already to pay money every week to contractors and for these projects, and to be paying loans with high interest and all this. Therefore, it's important to understand and work with investors, and for you to protect yourself, understand that there needs to be a contingency. Hopefully that add some value to your journey in property investment. My name is Noel Cardona. This is propertycashflow.co.uk. Please send me an email to info@propertycashflow.co.uk, or send me a WhatsApp message to 70411904124. Happy to have a conversation with you. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.